Welcome to the first ever Enhanced Games, dubbed by critics the Steroid Olympics. It's where athletes are encouraged to take performance-enhancing drugs that are normally banned in the world of professional elite sports. That's right, steroids, growth hormones, various performance-enhancing drugs are all okay at these games. Now, it's not just about sports and medicine, it's also about business and money. Swimmers, sprinters, and weightlifters are descending on Las Vegas this weekend to compete in these inaugural games. And yes, they may be putting their reputations on the line by participating in this controversial event, but they may also hit the jackpot. From the BBC, I'm Asma Khalid in Washington, D.C., and welcome to the Global Story on YouTube.
I'm Dan Rowan, and I'm the BBC's sports editor.
Well, Dan, it's a real pleasure to have you back on the show because I know you've been doing some reporting on a sporting event called the Enhanced Games. I should point out that some would say that name in and of itself might be a euphemism, Enhanced Games. But for the uninitiated, can you just explain what the games are? Because when I first heard about them and started reading into some of the reporting that you've done, I will say I thought it was a wild concept.
Yeah, I think many people share that view, Asma, and thanks for the invite back. Lovely to be with you again. I think the Enhanced Games, there's no doubt, I think it's fair to say it's one of the most divisive and controversial events that the world of sport has seen for a long time. It's an event where performance-enhancing drugs, banned elsewhere in mainstream sport, of course, are actually allowed to be taken by the competitors under medical supervision. Now, it's been described by many as a kind of steroid Olympics, it's become known. But these inaugural games, they're scheduled to take place in Las Vegas on May 24th, and the athletes involved can earn up to $1 million if they break the world record in their respective discipline, and $250,000 if they win their event. Organisers say that this is going to redefine the future of sport, that it's unique, that it celebrates athletic excellence while exploring the limits of human potential. It combines scientific innovation and performance enhancement with athlete welfare. But the critics, of course, say that this crosses an ethical line, that it sets a dreadful example because it risks normalising doping. It could harm the integrity, therefore, of sport, and it could be dangerous to the health of those taking part. Now, others say as well that athletes are at risk of being exploited for commercial reasons, because it is important to bear in mind that as well as a sports event, as we'll come on to, Enhanced is also what it calls itself a performance products company. So it is selling consumer health medication that those behind it claim will improve people's longevity and vitality. And they say that the athletes aren't being exploited, they're being handsomely rewarded, and that they're being open about these commercial objectives. But it is really important, I think, from the offset to emphasize that this is more than just a live sports event for entertainment. It's very much a business and a consumer platform too.
Dan, I think before we can dive any deeper into the conversation, I just want to understand what specific drugs we're talking about. I mean, presumably we're not talking about cocaine, heroin.
No, recreational substances like that are strictly banned, the organisers say. But what they are allowing are performance-enhancing substances such as testosterone, anabolic steroids, hormones and growth factors, metabolic modulators, and stimulants. So a wide range of substances. What the Enhanced Games organisers stress is that these are all FDA approved. They're all approved by the US Food and Drug Administration, and they're available for medical reasons already. But obviously, as I said, those substances have long been associated with cheating in sport, and so it is highly controversial that these athletes are being allowed and indeed helped to take them.
And Dan, I want to circle back to what we can actually expect from those Enhanced Games in Las Vegas. But I think it is important to understand how the competition came about, how this commercial enterprise came about. What was its origin story?
Well, I think for years, sport has obviously, as we know, waged this arduous, ongoing battle against drugs cheats to preserve the integrity of competition and ensure that those watching it can believe what they see. If you can't, then the whole point of it is eroded. And so this is fundamentally important to the foundations of sporting competition at all levels. But the prevalence of cheating in sport over generations has often, I think, led some to wonder whether to ensure a level playing field and regulate the practice whether doping should be allowed to some extent. Now, such suggestions have traditionally been condemned and dismissed, but the concept nonetheless has been around for a long time. But this particular vision of the enhanced games, it was conceived by an Australian venture capitalist and lawyer a few years ago, Aaron D'Souza, who says he came up with the idea when he was working out and he overheard two men talking about being enhanced, as they put it. And he then pitched the idea to Peter Thiel, the billionaire co-founder of PayPal, who he'd met at Oxford University when he was a student there, and Thiel had been a guest speaker. And also a German venture capitalist called Christian Angermayer also came on board as an investor and a co-founder. So that was the genesis of this.
How would you characterize the main philosophical argument behind these games?
If you look at what Aaron D'Souza has said over the years since conceiving this idea, there's a number, I think, of philosophical arguments being made. One is certainly a sort of anti-establishment disruptor angle. This argument that athletes are not being properly rewarded by the Olympic system, by the sporting authorities.
Financially not being properly rewarded.
Correct.
I see. Okay.
Absolutely, yes. And you put this to the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, and they'll argue, of course, that it does redistribute vast sums to national sporting federations as well as to grassroots projects. But I think that has indeed been for a long time now a debate as to whether enough money does filter its way down to the stars of the show, the athletes that are sacrificing so much to entertain so many and to generate the revenue that sporting bodies, of course, benefit from. So there's that angle. Then there's a libertarian perspective, I think, as well behind the enhanced games. It's being seen very much as a platform, a celebration even of self-sovereignty for freedom and personal choice through, technological innovation. Now, D'Souza has referenced studies that suggest that 44% of elite athletes may have used performance-enhancing drugs.
Is that
at some
accurate?
point in their careers. We don't know. I mean, it's contested by some, but I think he's referred to some studies that suggest it's very prevalent. And we know, don't we, from the numbers of athletes that have been found to have cheated over the years, that this is not uncommon. And we know this from the number of times that positive tests are discovered. So his argument, I think, is similar to those that argue for legalizing drugs. Rather than try to fight an unwinnable battle with all the costs involved, and in doing so push doping underground where there's no oversight, and corners can be cut and it's dangerous, why not allow it and do it in a more controlled environment? And then there's also, I think, this belief in longevity and self-optimization. Those behind it celebrate what they claim to be this new vision, this new frontier for human advancement. And the games is, you could argue, a platform for
to
that.
see what humans are capable of.
Correct, yeah, but also it's a promotion for the drugs that are being used and then will be sold. So, D'Souza's sort of spoken about, 60-year-olds potentially breaking world records with the aid of drugs. And so rather than just seeing it as a mere sporting event, as I said, you could also see it as almost an experiment to see what is possible biologically.
It sounds like the reaction to this event has been controversial. Controversial when you talk about the world of sports, right? When you talk about even possibly in terms of raising funds. So what has the reaction been like?
Well, yeah, as you'd expect, there's been widespread condemnation from the sporting authorities and the anti-doping authorities. For example, in 2024, the IOC and the World Anti-Doping Agency released a joint statement condemning the enhanced games. The Biden White House at the time also criticized it. The IOC referred to it destroying the concept of fair play and fair competition, or at least they say this would be a good way to do it. And at odds, it said, with the idea and the values of the games. The Athlete Council at WADA said that it ignored decades of medical evidence and the lived experience of athletes harmed by doping. The International Fair Play Committee said it was a potentially catastrophic healthcare risk to those taking part. And so a wave of condemnation, of course. D'Souza and those behind it dismissed much of that, and they believed that a lot of that criticism was unfair and somewhat hypocritical. And so, but there's no doubt that the reaction in the first year or two, up until this day, has been one of disappointment and I think and dismay in many quarters.
And so, despite some of that disappointment and dismay, how was D'Souza able to raise the funds? I mean, he's holding these games in Vegas. Presumably, they've got to build a venue, right? They need funders. How's that gone?
Well, I mentioned earlier that he'd attracted venture capitalists like Peter Thiel
Okay.
and Angermayer, and they'd already invested, these guys, in life-extending technologies. A Saudi investor called Prince Khaled was another who, it seemed, was interested in that as well, that kind of longevity medicine. He called it as the ultimate biohacking opportunity for elite athletes,
Huh.
and he referred to the data that it could produce when it came to trying to sort of extend research into longevity technologies. So I think that was what lay behind the investors, was the possibility that this could be very, very lucrative. And indeed, as I've mentioned, Enhanced in March, in fact, launched formally its sort of range of performance medicine and supplements, which included, hormone replacement therapy for men and women, supplements, longevity protocols, and it has said
And so
formally
those
that it
drugs are
is.
a revenue stream, you're saying?
Absolutely. And
Okay.
it said openly it wants to become the leading provider of personalized enhancement products. So what I should say is that earlier this month, the Enhanced Games started trading on the New York Stock Exchange,
Mm.
became a publicly traded company, and it's had a valuation of more than $1 billion even before this first event has
Wow.
taken place. So there is a lot of money involved, both in terms of the investing and I think
Uh-huh.
and the hopes of the investors in terms of how much they can make in the future.
I'd also read that President Trump's son, Donald Trump Jr., is involved in some financial
Yeah.
capacity. Can you explain that?
That's right, yes. Thiel, one of the investors behind the Enhanced Games, already had ties with the Trump White House, and that was reinforced when the 1789 Capital Fund, which is a fund which Donald Trump Jr., the eldest son of the US
Mhm.
president, has been a partner in, became another investor in Enhanced. And Trump Jr. said that the Games was about excellence, innovation, American dominance on the world stage, something he said that the MAGA movement, Make America Great Again, of course, is all about. So
Okay.
there is this connection, and that's been strengthened, I think, by some of the rhetoric of the health secretary under
Oh,
Donald Trump,
RFK
Robert
Jr.
F. Kennedy.
Mm.
Correct, and he's spoken about his use of testosterone replacement as part of an anti-aging protocol, and his "Make America Healthy Again," as it's called, campaign has referenced the deregulation of many treatments, including peptides, which would allow companies like Enhanced to sell them. This event does have ties with Trump.
So, despite it sounds like some of the initial controversy, these games got off the ground. And as we say, they're about to take place here in Las Vegas. I know that you visited a training facility for the Enhanced Games that took place in Abu Dhabi in the UAE. You reported on that prep. You interviewed some of the athletes who are going to be participating in these games. Can you give us a sense of who they are and why they said they want to participate in these games?
Absolutely, yes. It was a fascinating experience being able to go and see inside what must be one of the most controversial training camps in world sport in the UAE a couple of months ago. A range of athletes from all across the world were there who had signed up to this project. Perhaps one of the highest profiles, certainly, is British swimmer Ben Proud. He's a
Mm.
world and European champion at the 50-metre freestyle in swimming. He won silver at the 2024 Olympics in Paris. I mean, there is, I think, sometimes a misconception that these are all just athletes who have retired or are quite obscure. And far from it. This was a very serious Olympic athlete.
Even though I did all these things, I rarely received any sort of compensation. And you start to think, especially as a 31-year-old, what use is this? What's the point of spending 15 years building a skill just to retire and forget about it for the rest of my life?
Another British participant is a young woman called Emily Barclay, also a swimmer. Now, she won a gold medal in the 50-metre freestyle at the 2019 British Championships.
Didn't you go to
competed
college in
on the
America
university.
too, I think? Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, University of Arkansas in the
Okay.
US. So not anywhere near the same level as Proud, not an Olympic athlete, but nonetheless, somebody who's competed at a decent level, but maybe a different incentive. Here's what she said when I put to her that many would argue that she's setting a bad example to youngsters and potentially even putting herself at risk.
Doping is happening in sport, especially in gym communities. You hear a lot about people, buying it through the back door in unsafe ways, maybe even taking too much. I feel like the stuff that we're doing here is just going to facilitate, a better understanding of these sort of drugs that we'll be taking, so that in the future people can do it in a medically safe way.
Dan, you mentioned a couple of Brits who are competing in these games, but presumably there are people from a number of countries.
Absolutely, across the world, yes. I mean, I spoke to Americans such as Wes Kitts, a weightlifter, Cody Miller, very well-known US swimmer, an Australian former Olympic swimmer called James Magnuson, Irish athletes, Max McCusker, Shane Ryan. There's the US sprinter, Fred Curley, as well, very high profile again. So, I mean, I think that it's fair to say the majority are from Western countries, from Europe and the US, Australia, for example. But there are athletes in there from Africa, for example, as well. So it's a pretty broad range.
You mentioned only about 40 athletes are here at these games, and that doesn't seem particularly huge. Is that because there's presumably a cost to taking part in these enhanced games? I mean, if you are going to be an athlete here, are you not allowed, for example, to compete in the Olympics anymore?
Well, I think undoubtedly the consequences of signing up may well be deterring some from joining. I mean, it depends what sport you're in. So, for example, last year, World Aquatics became the first international sports federation to ban athletes, coaches, and officials from its events if they'd taken part in any way in the enhanced games. Now, other sports may feel differently. I mean, they're the only sport so far to have done that. I think it's a really big decision. I think for those who are sort of at the end of their elite careers or have retired, maybe it's an easier decision. But for the younger athletes who are still got ambitions at World Championship or even Olympic level, then this could be a really big moment if they turn their backs on that. But of course, balancing all that consequence is the incentive of these huge payouts if you're successful.
You've mentioned that if an athlete breaks a world record, they will get $1 million. If someone were to break a world record, what's your sense of whether breaking a record while taking these drugs devalues the record in any way?
I think that's a really good question, and it's one that I thought long and hard about when I was at the Enhanced Games training camp, because they emphasize that they are not trying to compete with the Olympics, for example, or World Championships. This is their own event. It's in a separate context. But of course, I guess inevitably one can argue, well, you are connecting with the mainstream world of sport because you are setting that benchmark of the world record and saying if you can beat it, then we will financially reward you. And in doing so, there is that link. I put this to the chief executive and a co-founder of the Enhanced Games, Maximilian Martin.
How would you feel if you were the record holder that's dedicated your entire career to competing clean, naturally, and then somebody comes along and takes that record? Does that not devalue that record?
It doesn't, because it's set under a completely different set of rules. And also the traditional federation is not accepting that record as a record.
When you were in Abu Dhabi reporting on this training facility where the athletes were, prepping for the games and taking these drugs, what did they tell you? I mean, what does that actually look like in practice? Who's giving them the drugs?
Well, the administering of these enhancements, as they call them, was being conducted under medical supervision, that the organisers emphasised, in a hospital on the outskirts of Abu Dhabi. Now, we were originally told before heading out there that the aim was to give us access to that facility and let us speak to the medics actually administering these drugs. We did, as you can see in the film, we did take a quick drive to this hospital on the outskirts of the city. It was very modern, with a good reputation, but we weren't allowed actually in. But we did get the chance to speak to the head of the medical commission that the Enhanced Games has set up, which it says plays a role in safeguarding the athletes by establishing safety protocols. It's emphasising that this enhancement program is absolutely strictly supervised. And in terms of how this looks like, I mean, how it was described to me was that these athletes were taking part effectively in a clinical trial model that would replace the sort of traditional anti-doping testing. Again, we weren't able to actually see it for ourselves, and we were told that each athlete would be given an individualized program of enhancements. And from what I was told, these enhancements would be taken in the hospital. They would be given sort of individualized health biomarker monitoring that would focus on safety profiling. So this would involve, for example, cardiovascular health, so checks for myocardial function, blood counts would be assessed, to detect any potential adverse effects. Genetic screening, electrocardiograms, and also brain health monitoring to track sort of neurological function. So they really were trying to emphasize to us that this was very thorough, much better than athletes would be used to in conventional elite programs, and that should, in some way, sort of answer some of the concerns over health risks. We spoke to Dr. Dan Turner, for example, the Enhanced Games Director of Athlete Safety and Performance, who insisted that this monitoring meant that the risks could be minimised. And he said that it's not the use of the substances that was dangerous per se, but rather the misuse. But there are many critics who think it's irresponsible and dangerous.
You know, I think for a lot of people who follow sports, who really love sports, these games might seem controversial because for so long we've been told that using these types of performance-enhancing drugs, doping, is unfair, that it's cheating the system. It's cheating perhaps other players, it's cheating the fans, and now you're describing a world where it's all totally okay under the rules. Is that the primary criticism you've been hearing? Are there health or medical concerns you're also hearing?
I think that it's both of those issues. If we take the first one, I think there is, because this, according to many, kind of violates the values of fair play that we've associated with elite sport at any level, in fact, for so long. I think many find it very difficult to accept. And if you talk to someone such as an anti-doping agency, like the UK Anti-Doping Agency, Jane Rumble is the chief executive, and I asked her what she made of the fear that this could set a really bad example to athletes everywhere, and in doing so lead to more occurrences of cheating.
The key concern that I've got about the potential impact of these enhanced games is very much on the next generation. So the young people who may tune in and watch these games or hear about it, I do very much believe that it sends a dangerous message about performance-enhancing drugs, with little, if anything, said about the health risks associated with performance-enhancing drugs.
And then I think that the second main concern is that this could actually involve health risks to those taking part. Now, we know that some of the substances involved, scientific research has shown that long-term use can lead to damage, for example, to the heart, to the liver. It can disrupt the body's natural hormone production. It can affect fertility, can even affect a person's mood and mental health.
I think it's been misrepresented to the athletes. I think the athletes are exposed to some substantial unknown risks that they're just not being made aware of.
I spoke to Professor Ian Bordley of Birmingham University, who's conducted research into some of these substances. Now, he says that there are clear health risks with some of them. He speaks about the fact that, notwithstanding the supervised nature of the Enhanced Games protocols, there's still uncertainty around the long-term effects years into the future, and also what may happen when different substances are combined.
The athletes are being told that their safety can be protected, and even if there are tests that will happen in several years from now, what will they do if they are showing effects on the athletes? Because some of the effects are irreversible.
Dan, you also spoke with an athlete, an Australian swimmer by the name of James Magnuson, and asked him whether he had concerns about the long-term health impacts of taking these drugs. And this is what he said.
I think as professional athletes, we take risks with our health innately by what we do. There's nothing healthy about training at your peak of your physical ability for 30 hours a week.
What he's saying is that the physical training that a lot of top-level athletes go through is perhaps just as dangerous as taking performance-enhancing drugs. You are someone who follows and watches sports and covers and reports on sports much more extensively than I do. What do you make of that argument, that athletes are already living these somewhat abnormal, some would say unhealthy lifestyles, pushing their bodies to the extremes?
I think many people would dismiss that position on the basis that, in the most part, training regimes don't mean the sort of risks that could occur with taking these substances. Certainly if you believe what some of the scientific experts have said, notwithstanding the fact, of course, that those behind the games insist that they are supervised and they are taking all the checks that are appropriate. But I do think that Magnuson's position is really interesting, because I think that undoubtedly some believe that it is perhaps hypocritical of sports authorities to condemn this for involving potential risk, when elite sport by its very nature does, in many cases, involve risk or harm. But that's accepted because it's entertaining. To be an Olympian will inevitably often involve pushing one's body to the limit. That's what I think Magnussen is trying to get across, whether that's through, intense training regimes, some of the sacrifices that one has to make. Look at combat sports, for example, like boxing, obviously. Look at the prevalence of potential brain injuries in that sport,
Yep.
not just in boxing, but not just combat sports, a range of contact sports, whether that's NFL in the States or whether it's rugby or even football. Look at the amount of athlete welfare scandals there have been. So I think, you could argue that, the enhanced games, while perhaps involving risk, isn't necessarily that inconsistent with the world of sport.
Dan, these games are going to take place in Las Vegas. You were at a training camp in Abu Dhabi. I think it's fair to say that if anybody spent a lot of time in those places, there's something that kind of culturally makes sense to me that these games are happening in those venues. At the same time, the Enhanced Games also seems like an event of our times, of our era. It feels like a very 2026 cultural phenomenon. The idea of self-optimization, of human enhancement, it feels so alive in the zeitgeist right now. Is it your sense that the existence of these games, the amount of money that's being poured into them, is part of a bigger cultural conversation?
Yeah, I do think it speaks to perhaps a weakening of the taboo that for a long time has existed around taking performance-enhancing drugs. We know, don't we, that millions of Americans use unregulated PEDs. There's been other surveys conducted over here in the UK that recently found that a third of young people have bought performance-enhancing drugs that are deemed life-threatening.
Oh, wow.
And have not been approved for human consumption. So this is very relevant.
Wow.
It's very live issue. And I think there are inevitably, therefore, big fears that this all adds up to a kind of normalization of what up until recently was regarded with a great deal of skepticism and taboo. I think in sport, we've seen, haven't we, in recent years, a number of innovations, disruptive concepts, whether it's esports, whether it's social media influencers fighting, traditional boxers in Las Vegas or in Saudi Arabia. What appeals to a younger generation now is very different to what traditional sports fans have grown accustomed to. Some aren't comfortable with it. Some believe it's okay, that it's about sport growing, pushing the boundaries. I don't think many things, though, have been quite as controversial as what we're about to see in Las Vegas.
On that note, Dan, thanks so much for joining us back on the show. We really appreciate it.
Pleasure.
That's it for The Global Story on YouTube. Thanks for tuning in. And if you appreciated our episode today, then I recommend checking out The Global Story as an audio podcast. That's right. You can find us every weekday on bbc.com or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. And a quick recommendation before you go. If you're looking for a way to learn more about the Enhanced Games, I highly recommend checking out the documentary that Dan Rowan made. You can find it on YouTube. It's called Enhanced Games, A Sporting Revolution or Dangerous Doping.